Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this 10,000 plus subscriber special. I have to say, I had no idea that so many people would be so enthusiastic about a military analysis of a 4-year-old fantasy film. And at the beginning of the year, I didn't think anyone would be interested in a long rant with less than perfect audio aimed at the tactics in The Last Jedi. I am now eligible for monetization, which is something that wasn't true just a couple of months ago. This year has been a rollercoaster for sure. I would like to thank everyone for subscribing and sharing my videos. I am truly thankful. It may be cliché, but this dream would not have been realised without you. I was wondering what the subject could be for this video, and was a little worried that I would not think of something interesting to comment on. However, as I was reading the comments under my latest video, I noticed an interesting argument, which I've seen crop up under other videos on YouTube, and indeed used as an argument by other YouTubers, albeit in different contexts. The argument goes something like this. Humans don't always act rationally in real life. Therefore, it is realistic for villains and heroes to make irrational mistakes in a story. Normally, the people who make this argument under my videos quote various silly decisions military commanders have made throughout history to back up their statements. I say this is an interesting argument because it looks sensible at first glance. But there is a problem when applying this logic to fiction thoughtlessly, and I will stress thoughtlessly here because there is a more thoughtful way of doing this. Let's concern ourselves with the problem of taking a real-life observation from military history books and applying it to fiction in a wholesale manner. However, first we must consider said history books. When we read a history book, we read it for facts. The ridiculous actions of some individuals in history might make us shake our heads in disbelief, but we have no trouble believing such things because they are mentioned in a history book. Whether the actions make sense or not is more or less irrelevant for the reader of history because he is reading for the facts, not necessarily to understand what makes sense or not. However, the reader of fiction does not read the action story for facts. He reads it to be entertained by vicariously participating in a journey of a hero fighting against a villain. For the tale of the protagonist to be both entertaining and heroic, the villain must be threatening. You cannot have an impressive or admirable hero unless you have a villain who poses a serious challenge. If, in the Epic of Beowulf, Grendel was not a large weird, but instead a normal man, Beowulf wouldn't be such a hero for defeating him. When writing a story filled with military conflict, a villain is made a challenge by the number of his forces, their competence in combat, and his ability to lead said forces into combat. When a villain consistently makes silly errors in a story, not only is the suspension of disbelief threatened, because, after all, if the villain is so incompetent, how did he become such a threat in the first place? But secondly, and more importantly in my opinion, the villain is reduced to the state of non-threat to the hero. If the villain is too incompetent for the audience to perceive him as a dangerous challenge to the hero, then the story will be dull. As well, if the hero makes obvious mistakes, and these are not exploited by the villain, not only does it look like lazy or sloppy writing, but it also makes the villain look incompetent or stupid, and makes him less threatening, and thus dulls whatever excitement might have existed in the story. Now I said that in my opinion, the dulling of excitement by villainous incompetence is more of a problem than the disruption of disbelief caused by the same villainous incompetence. I hold this opinion because if a tale is exciting or entertaining enough, we are very likely to overlook areas which ruined our suspension of disbelief for a few moments, and instead make judgments of the story based on the whole, rather than specific parts. If the story isn't exciting because the villain is a joke, then every single moment something destroys the suspension of disbelief, it is all the sharper and all the more painful. It will also be more keenly engraved on the reader's memory. Now, all I have said may be well and good. However, there is one issue. In order for a hero to win in his fight, the villain must make errors. If the villain doesn't make a mistake, then the hero can't win. So how do we have the villain make an error without appearing stupid or incompetent? First, we must categorize the types of thoughtful mistakes a villain can make, and in my estimation, there are two distinct categories. The first is errors in hindsight, and the second is errors of vice. Before I go further, I should state that regardless of which error your villain makes, he should still not be easy to defeat. The best thing is to have your villain's mistake open up the possibility of victory, but make it a hard and difficult possibility. If you do this, your hero's victory will be all the more glorious. Now let's discuss errors in hindsight. I have two examples. The first is the confrontation between John McClane and Hans Gruber at the end of Die Hard. In this scene, John McClane outsmarts Hans and fools him into thinking he does not have a weapon by misdirecting Hans' attention to the submachine gun in his hand, while hiding a pistol on his back. Now I call this villainous mistake an error in hindsight, because there was simply no way for Hans to guess that John McClane would adopt such an unorthodox strategy to try and save his wife. Putting myself into Hans' shoes, I can't see how he would have been able to predict such a move. Maybe Hans should have expected John McClane to have some kind of trick up his sleeve, and perhaps he did, but not seeing any weapon on him discounted his previous fears. In short, this is a forgivable mistake on Hans' part, and the only way he would have known this was a mistake would have been by looking back on the situation with hindsight, something he doesn't get to do. My second example doesn't actually contain the main villain of the film, but it does contain one of his minions. I am of course talking about Captain Needa in The Empire Strikes Back. In a very famous scene, Han Solo outsmarts Captain Needa by employing a space smuggler's tactic, hiding under the sensors of the Star Destroyer. For those of us who have watched the film multiple times, it might be easy to say Captain Needa should have considered the possibility that the Millennium Falcon was hiding under his ship's scanners. However, if we limit our near omniscient knowledge to what Needa knows about the situation, and try to place ourselves in his shoes, his reasoning makes more sense. All Needa knows in this scene is that the Falcon has mysteriously disappeared, and he jumps to a sensible but nevertheless incorrect conclusion. He considers the possibility that the rebels might have invented a cloaking device for use in smaller ships. Considering he is a captain of a Star Destroyer, presumably trained to fight battles against other capital ships in a conventional style, it makes sense that he wouldn't anticipate or even be familiar with the strategies of smugglers or guerrilla fighters. The only person who correctly guesses what Han did in this scene is Boba Fett, a bounty hunter who probably knows all the tricks in that book. Moreover, it is possible that Needa would have figured out Han's deception if he hadn't been interrupted by a message from Darth Vader asking for information on the Falcon. At the point of receiving the message, all Needa can think about is whether Darth Vader will forgive him or not. The only sensible criticism is the question as to why Needa didn't use a tractor beam. However, in the films at least, Star Destroyers don't appear to have tractor beams. The Death Star in A New Hope has tractor beams, and the Super Star Destroyer has a tractor beam in The Empire Strikes Back, but I was unable to find any references or examples of Star Destroyers using tractor beams in the original trilogy. So it would appear that using a tractor beam was not an option for Captain Needa. In both these examples, there isn't the impression that Hans and Needa are stupid, and thus they retain a level of threat and challenge which is essential for keeping tension at a healthy level in the story. As well, because they are not stupid, the hero's victories over them are all the more impressive. So much then for errors in hindsight. An error of vice is a mistake made because of a personality flaw. For instance, a villain might be overconfident or too cautious, and thus lose the critical final confrontation with the hero. Now, I believe it is much harder for a writer to effectively create errors of vice for his villains than errors in hindsight. Why? Because there is a significant risk of making a vice that is all too convenient. If a villain's errors and flaws are very convenient for the hero, it can be like that moment in a puppet show, where a curtain falls and the audience gets to see the puppeteer. It is not a good thing. The audience doesn't want to see the author's strings pulling the story in the direction he so wishes. The audience wants to forget for the moment they are watching a film, and just enjoy the adventure. Another thing easy to get wrong when writing errors of vice is the explanation of the villain's character flaw that leads to the execution of the fatal mistake which the hero exploits. It has to be established fairly early, and with reasonable clarity, that the villain has a character flaw. A writer cannot just pull out a character flaw at the last moment to explain why a villain erred. He has to write the story in such a manner that everyone knows the villain's vice already. Now I'm going to argue that a good example of an error of vice and of not making things easy for the heroes can be found in Star Wars: A New Hope. The vice which leads to the errors can be first seen in the meeting Grand Moff Tarkin and Darth Vader attend. That vice being arrogance mixed with hubris. One of the commanders represents the arrogance of the Empire in this scene, while the other represents a more sensible assessment of the situation. While the first commander is convinced that the rebels might be able to destroy the Death Star now they have the plans, the second commander is convinced that the rebels do not pose any threat to the Death Star. In fact, he goes further than this, and claims that the Death Star means the Empire is now the ultimate power in the universe, which prompts a negative dismissal from Darth Vader. This arrogance is later commented upon by the officer briefing the pilots in the rebel base about the Death Star's weakness, where it is mentioned that the Empire doesn't consider small one-man fighters to be a threat, as evidenced by their defences not being optimised to counter them. This feeling of invincibility apparently extended from the commanders to the engineers themselves. Please note I am ignoring the existence of the film called Rogue One to illustrate that A New Hope's Death Star problems didn't need an admittedly enjoyable cash grab to be explained. This imperial arrogance is later displayed from Grand Moff Tarkin, when he is warned that the rebels might actually have a chance of destroying the Death Star, and is advised to evacuate. His response is to sniff at the idea of evacuation, and says that this is going to be their moment of triumph. This arrogance and hubris, commented upon and displayed by the Imperial commanders, explains why they didn't defend the exhaust port more effectively, and why they didn't send out hundreds of TIE fighters to attack the small rebel fighter wings. Why bother wasting time and resources against a group of fighters who cannot possibly damage your shiny and fully operational battle station? This explanation, of course, doesn't excuse Grand Moff Tarkin's decision to underestimate his opponents, as it is never wise to underestimate your foes. He should have assumed that the rebels knew something he didn't, and sent out swarms of TIE fighters to meet the rebel fighter wings before they reached the Death Star, just to be safe. I am of course assuming Tarkin knew that the turrets on the Death Star wouldn't be able to hit a one-man fighter, and it is possible that he didn't know this, although the Death Star engineers would probably have been aware of this. Now I think George Lucas knew that he would receive criticism for the error of vice which created the rather convenient Death Star weakness, and so decided to make it a difficult task to destroy the Death Star even with this weakness. In the briefing, the officer says the attack won't be easy, mentioning there is only one restricted way to approach the vent, and that the vent, which leads to the main reactor, is only 2 meters wide. As well, the only missiles which can go through the ray shields protecting it are proton torpedoes, and only a direct hit will do the job. One of the pilots exclaims that it is an impossible task even for a computer, and Luke is the only one who seems to think that it is possible to take such a shot. In the battle, 6 fighter pilots die in attempts to shoot torpedoes into the main reactor. One of them actually gets in range and fires with the computer assisting, but still fails to score a direct hit. Luke manages to score a direct hit in his attempt. However, he only succeeds because he takes Obi-Wan's advice to use the Force instead of the computer. And the only reason Luke was alive to take the shot at the end is because Han Solo and Chewie had a change of heart and arrived to attack the fighters chasing him. Luke then destroys the Death Star seconds before it is able to destroy the rebel base, and before all this happened, several pilots died from turret fire and dogfights. To say the rebels had an easy time destroying the Death Star wouldn't be accurate, even though the Imperials didn't seem to be taking the assault too seriously. Making the attack difficult was a good move by George Lucas, because it makes for interesting and exciting action, while still ensuring that the Empire, no matter its flaws, is still a challenge to the heroes. Now that I've discussed the different errors which can be made by villains without making them seem incapable or stupid, I have to confess something. Contrary to how it may seem, unreasonable or questionable military decisions in films do not in and of themselves annoy me. I will notice them, but they only ruin my enjoyment if they make the villains weak or incompetent. If the villains are still a believable threat and challenge to the heroes, I tend to overlook them immediately. Allow me to discuss the Battle of Helm's Deep. I said in the video prior, and the comment section, that I thought the decision of many of the Uruks to stand close to the wall, doing literally nothing, waiting to be shot by arrows or blown up by the bombs of their engineers, was bad. I still hold this opinion, because they could have still blown up the wall, and with fewer casualties, if they just told the pikemen to stand back, and had a group form a tortoise formation to protect the engineers. Yes, Uruks are stupid, so this can be counted as an error of vice, but that doesn't mean the decision cannot be criticised. Fans still give the Imperials flack for the Death Star weakness after all. However, this is really a moot point at the end of the day. like the Death Star weakness, because throughout the entirety of the battle scene, the sieging Uruk army still comes across as a real threat to the heroes. Their small number of questionable decisions are overshadowed by their impressive abilities to kill the soldiers and companions of the heroes. They pose a credible threat, not only because of their appearance, strength and numbers, but also because the other tactics they employ are quite sensible, which is why the battle scene works. I happen to feel this way about the rest of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, by the way. With all this said, I don't think the battles in The Last Jedi and The Hobbit, The Battle of the Five Armies work, because the villains come across as incapable and unthreatening. And the reason the villains come across as incapable and unthreatening in both these films is because they make elementary errors and seem unable to exploit the mistakes of their enemies. Allow me to try and demonstrate this. Let's take Azog at the beginning of the battle, for instance. He has gigantic worms which could level a city in minutes. He knew before going into battle that these worms were at his disposal, and he, or someone in his army at the least, knows how to control them. So the question is, why didn't Azog use the worms to crush the elven and dwarven armies? I'm sure one could come up with 100 explanations. Most of these would probably be an example of the viewer writing the script for the director, but I think the most obvious explanation is this. It didn't cross Azog's mind to use the worms, because he is an orc, and orcs are simple-minded. This is a reasonable explanation, because after all, orcs are mutilated elves and their culture revolves around violence, so I don't think such an explanation would be controversial or difficult to accept. However, this explained reason has the effect of making Azog seem unintelligent, and thus the impression given is that he is not as dangerous as he might appear, because he doesn't understand the value of the forces at his disposal. Let's imagine the scene where the worms appear, but change it a bit. What if the worms appeared and started attacking the elven and dwarven armies before Azog was revealed on top of his mountain, urging the worms to destroy his enemies? How much more of a threat would Azog appear to be in this revised scene? I think the answer is a lot more. It wouldn't even matter if the worms were killed relatively quickly, because Azog could give an amused smile and say something akin to, "Impressive, but ultimately futile. My armies, finish them," before sending his troops into battle. In this version of the scene, Azog would be far more intimidating, because he would be presented as an orc who effectively uses all his assets to try and win in battle, and has a plan B in case his plan A fails. As the actual scene currently stands, Azog's decision not to use the worms makes him look thoughtless, and it is too convenient for the heroes, because if the worms attacked, then the dwarves and the elves would have a serious problem to worry about. Unfortunately, it isn't the only time something like this happens in the film. It happens again when the orcs start charging at the dwarven phalanx and don't attempt outflanking it, even though the flanks don't seem to be protected. It makes the orcs less of a threat, and it is too convenient for the heroes, because we know that if the orcs did attempt to flank the incomplete line, the heroes would be in a tight spot. For contrast, in the Battle of Helm's Deep, when the Uruks blow a hole in the wall and start pouring in, they also immediately start attacking the gate with a battering ram, and soon break a hole in it, which is wide enough to send troops through. Moreover, everything the Uruks are shown possessing, they use. They have bombs, so they blow up a wall. They have crossbows, so they shoot people. They have ladders, so they climb them. They have ballistae, and so they use them. The Uruks are willing to use every asset at their disposal, and it is clear that Peter Jackson was not worried about putting the heroes in sticky situations, which they would struggle surviving. This is again why the Uruks are a threat and why the battle scene of Helm's Deep is so good. So this is why I think the argument, "but people aren't always logical," misses a crucial part of storycraft. If your villains make decisions which are, by and large, illogical, they will not be threatening. And if your heroes make decisions which are also largely illogical, then your villains will end up looking stupid if they do not exploit those mistakes. In both cases, such villains are not threatening. This is also why I cannot abide with arguments such as, "it's just a film," or "it's a fantasy," and so on, or that somehow pointing out the bad tactics is nitpicking, because such statements miss the fundamental point. The military incompetence in the films I have examined had an effect on the audience enjoyment of those films, and their appreciation of the villains. I am not the only YouTuber who has criticised the battle scenes in The Last Jedi, and I do not believe I am the only one who has thought the tactics could have been better in the Battle of the Five Armies. These things would appear to reduce audience enjoyment. To hammer this home, allow me to pose a question. Who can you remember more easily? Villains such as Darth Vader, Grand Moff Tarkin, and Hans Gruber, or villains such as Azog, Kylo Ren, and General Hux? Because if I didn't have a keen memory, and hadn't spent too much time thinking about the Star Wars sequels and the Hobbit films, I would have forgotten all about Azog, Hux, and Kylo. In fact, I did forget Azog's name until I started researching for my last video. Now, I must admit to being able to remember Kylo Ren, and many of the scenes he was in. The ones in The Force Awakens before he took off his mask. Before he took off his mask, I thought Kylo was good villain material. Not anymore, but those few scenes before he took off his mask are still quite clear in my mind. Now a second question. Who is the better villain, Grand Moff Tarkin or General Hux? Hans Gruber or Azog? And how about a third question since we are here? In The Hobbit: The Battle of the Five Armies, the orcs have a difficult time taking down a group of human peasants led by a bard who doesn't even sing. Can you imagine the orcs from The Lord of the Rings having such a difficult time? Which would you rather face, the orcs from The Hobbit or the orcs from The Lord of the Rings? These comparisons might seem unfair, but I think they illustrate a clear point. Villains who make errors, and plenty of them, will never be as appreciated as villains who make fewer, more forgivable kinds of mistakes. There are other factors which make a villain good and memorable. Of course there are. Factors such as appearance or hand-to-hand fighting capabilities count as well. An example would be Thanos in Infinity War, where in the first scene of the film he beats the Hulk in a fistfight. However, writing a villain who makes sensible military decisions is a core part of creating one who is good and memorable in a story with military conflict. This is why I think it is important for writers to be careful about the kind of errors their villains make, especially those of a military nature. Too many villainous errors only hurt the story and the audience enjoyment of it. Now, I must admit I only stated in my first military analysis video that these are the reasons I dislike questionable military decisions in films and storytelling, but I hope this elaboration clears up some things. Thank you all for watching, and thank you so much for your subscriptions, upvotes and shares. I hope you all have an excellent day.